This video is sponsored by the Center for Writing and Speaking at Agnes Scott College.
Hi, thank you for joining us today for the 2020 Essential Elements for Writing workshop series. For the next couple of sessions, we will discuss the anatomy of a paper. I am Felicia Jacques, and I'm a senior at Agnes Scott. To get us started, I will briefly discuss the function of an introduction. An introduction functions as a way to inform your audience about the purpose of your paper and preview the content of your paper. In addition, an introduction serves as a space where you as a writer can provide background information for the audience to understand your topic. Overall, with an effective introduction, you could grab the attention of your reader and ensure that they will be interested in what you have to say. Coming up next, you'll hear from Arin Yost about the approaches to an introduction.
Hi friends, this is Arin, and now that Felicia has covered the function of an intro, I'll be talking about what you want to keep in mind when you're writing it. You'll want to think about your intro as a funnel, going from very broad to very narrow. Your introduction is going to set up your reader for your thesis statement, but you want to give the right information to make sure that this happens effectively. This might change depending on who your audience is, but for example, it might be helpful to introduce specialized language or jargon before you get into the bulk of your evidence. Sometimes, a miniature lit review might be helpful to include in your introduction, but this usually applies only to longer sections that may have an intro or background section rather than an intro paragraph. In your introduction, you also want to prove why your thesis is important. Address any important gaps in the literature, and make sure your audience knows what new information you plan to offer in your paper. Something else to keep in mind when writing an introduction is the overall length of your paper. Sometimes it might be fitting to just write a few sentences. For very lengthy essays, however, you might end up writing half a page or more. However, all introductions should have the same basic elements, which Amaris is going to talk more about now.
Hi friends. Now that Arin has shown us how to prepare for writing our introductory paragraphs, let's discuss some of their key components before we look at some examples. As a rule of thumb, it can be helpful to remember that the introduction is the way in which you ease your reader or audience into the topic and purpose of your essay. We have all experienced beginning a new TV show, then deciding to stop watching out of boredom or an unpiqued interest. A similar scenario can be applied to writing our essays as well, so we must catch the reader's attention in our writing by including a hook or an attention grabber. Some common examples of hooks include relevant statistics, a historical fact, or even a question. Certain types of hooks may be viewed as inappropriate depending on how formal an essay is or the discipline the essay is being written in. If you are concerned about the appropriateness of your hook, don't hesitate to follow up with your professor or visit a tutor in the CWS for a second opinion. Another key component of an introduction includes relevant context that leads the reader to your thesis. As Arin mentioned in the previous section, you want to show the reader why your thesis is important, so the relevant context that you provide should ultimately add value and clarify the actual thesis statement. It is important to note that the amount of relevant context that you include is dependent on your audience. Ask yourself, are you writing to those familiar with the content and topic of your essay or an audience that is not? Relevant context includes, but is not limited to, historical background and scholarly discourse that shows how your topic exists in a larger academic conversation or how it is viewed by a certain community or society. While the context you provide may not include all of the mentioned items, providing your reader with some form of contextualization is encouraged. Once you have provided your audience with relevant context, it is then crucial to state your thesis. Rather than just stating your thesis after you've listed a bunch of context, transition into it with a bridge sentence. Your bridge sentence may be a brief statement about your thoughts about the context that you just mentioned, or your overall thoughts or stance about the topic. American standards for college-level writing tend to encourage students to place the thesis as the last sentence of their introductory paragraph. For the purposes of organization and clear identification, placing your thesis as the last sentence of the intro can work out in your best interest. As a recap, the 4 key components of an introduction includes a hook or an attention grabber, relevant context that is specific to your audience, a bridge sentence to transition into your thesis, and the actual thesis statement. Now that we are aware of the key components of an intro paragraph, Leah will show us some of the types of introductions we see in writing.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for engaging with this workshop. We hope that all the information so far has been helpful. My name is Leah Trotman, and I am a senior and third-year tutor at the Center for Writing and Speaking. Earlier in the workshop, Felicia, Arin, and Amaris discussed the function, approach to, and elements of an introduction. In this section, we're going to go even further and look at the differences between an introduction in a personal statement, research paper, and an analytical paper. Let's first start with what introductions look like in a personal statement. Briefly, a personal statement is designed to 1. Provide a snapshot of who you are as a person, 2. Invite your reader to get to know you, and 3. Reveal your priorities and ability to discern effectively through creative storytelling and less structured writing. We are normally required to write personal statements when applying for graduate school or larger scholarships and grants like the Marshall, Rhodes, and Fulbright. With this context in mind, what should an introduction in a personal statement include? Most writers tend to start off an introduction with a funny, shocking, interesting, or original anecdote. Doing so can help grab the attention of a reader and entice them to read more. But choosing one can also help writers narrow down how much personal information they want to and should include in their personal statement. I was born in the middle of a hurricane. That's not something that everyone can say and could be used as an opening line to interest my reader. What could you write in an opening line to entice your reader? When you think about that opening line, be sure that your anecdote is relevant to present interests and career goals. I am interested in the impact of natural disasters like hurricanes on health, and so talking about being born in a hurricane is a great introduction to my career goals and interests. You may also want to include a guiding philosophy or principle in your introduction that will help your reader understand what's about to come in the rest of the personal statement. Having a guiding philosophy or principle also tells the reader what is most important to you and what you want them to walk away with after reading your statement. When I wrote one of my most recent personal statements, I included a line or two about how important community is to me in my introduction because that's something I want the reader to walk away knowing. And then I made sure to make constant reference to community throughout the rest of my personal statement. The guiding philosophy should be the central theme throughout your paper. It is important to note that personal statements are extremely, well, as you can imagine, personal. A funny anecdote might not work for someone whose regular conversation does not contain humor. As a writer, you have to find what works best for you. It is also important to note that the requirements of a personal statement are also dictated by the institution asking for the personal statement. So be sure to check what they are asking of you before you write. And lastly, the CWS has a handout on preparing to write a personal statement. Feel free to check out the link in the description. Let's now turn our attention towards what to include in an introduction for a research paper and an analytical paper. We get these papers a lot at Agnes Scott. So what should the introductions in these papers look like? More or less, these introductions share the following 4 specific elements. 1. Your introduction paragraph in both a research paper and an analytical paper should give a brief overview of what you hope to discuss in your paper. What are you writing about in your paper? What is your topic? What is your time period? Who are the main actors? Do you need to talk about or mention a key theory or concept? In the rest of your paper, you will go more in depth, but you want to give your audience a taste by answering the who, what, where, and when. Second, your introduction should also include a sentence or two acknowledging whether you are adding to an already existing body of research, covering a gap in research, or combining different theories to create an altogether new perspective. Introduction paragraphs in research papers tell the writer's audience where their research paper falls in the overall discipline. Notice that I mention only research papers include this. Analytical papers tend to focus on 1 or 2 sources and don't necessarily ask students to incorporate other sources. However, this could change based on professor requirements and the type of analytical essay. Third, your introduction should include a thesis statement. As Amaris previously stated, thesis statements are found near the end of an introduction and tell the reader what you will argue in the rest of your paper. It provides focus and clarity for you as a writer and also for your reader. For more information on how to write a thesis statement, please check out our Thesis Statements and Topic Development Workshop. The link will be in the description. And lastly, your introduction should include, so what? I'm sure you have heard this many times before in your classes. Essentially, the so what clause shows your readers why your paper is important to either your discipline or to society. What are the larger implications of your topic? Why is it important that you study this topic? Include your so what clause following your thesis statement. If you want more help on how to develop your so what clause, visit our Thesis Statements and Topic Development Workshop. Now, before I hand this workshop over to Felicia to chat about the function of a conclusion, I want to make it known that while research papers and analytical papers have more or less the same things in their introductions, the papers look completely different. For more information, check out our Analysis by Discipline workshop. There, we will discuss how to write research papers, which are more heavily assigned in social science classes, and analytical papers, which are more heavily assigned in English literature classes.
Now we will discuss the functions of a conclusion. A conclusion functions as a way to wrap up your point of view. Writers can restate the main argument as they remind readers of the evidence they use to support their argument. At the same time, try not to simply paraphrase or summarize your paper. The conclusion is not only for repeating your main argument, but it is a time to broaden the scope of your topic. Furthermore, a conclusion serves as a moment to add value to your field and include why an argument is significant. In other words, this can be seen as answering the so what question. By going over the so what question, you can consider how your topic expands to a broader conversation. This allows you to explore the importance of your topic in another context. Maybe your topic relates to the larger concept of the class, or it explores the solution to a social problem. Overall, answering the so what question in your conclusion expands the relevance of your paper. Sometimes you could also strengthen your conclusion by posing new questions. When you pose a new question, you are asking readers to think about a new question or concept that emerged from your work. Overall, the conclusion works as an ending that thoroughly brings together all of your claims in your paper. Arin Yost will be going over the approaches to the conclusion next.
Hi friends, it's Arin back again, but this time we're going to talk about approaching the conclusion. When thinking about writing an effective conclusion, consider these points adapted from the University of Southern California's writing guides. Think about your conclusion as the inverse of the introduction. You're going from narrow to broad in order to convince your reader that what you have to say is significant. This is the opposite approach to writing an introduction. You'll move from a very detailed analysis to a general consideration of context and implications. You should consider the complexity of your argument as well when you're approaching your conclusion. If your paper is very long or complicated, it is probably helpful to summarize your argument pretty in depth. Otherwise, just highlighting your main points will likely be sufficient. Finally, when writing a conclusion, remember that you do not want to bring up new ideas. It should neatly wrap up your essay, not introduce new loose ends. Next, you're going to hear from Amaris about what specific elements of the conclusion will serve this purpose.
Hey, Amaris here. Earlier, you heard me discuss some of the key components of an introductory paragraph. Now let's talk about some of the key components that we see in an effective conclusion paragraph. When writing your conclusion, you are completing a brief recap of the information that you have spent time discussing in your essay. An effective conclusion paragraph is succinct and does justice to your main points of the essay. Begin your conclusion by restating your thesis statement. Although you are restating the thesis, it should not simply be copied and pasted from your introductory paragraph. Be sure to change the wording and phrasing for distinguishing purposes. If your essay is long, the reader has spent a lot of time taking in a lot of information. By restating your thesis, you remind the reader of your personal stance and purpose. After reminding the reader of your stance and purpose by restating your thesis, you want to mention some of the main points you discussed in the body paragraphs of your essay. What points did you use to support the argument? Why were these points chosen and important? Considering these questions can help narrow your scope when choosing what information to recap. Providing a recap of your main points can be dangerous territory for overly explaining your essay. Remember, you've spent an entire paper defending your stance and discussing your topic, so avoid summarizing your entire paper in the conclusion paragraph. As Arin suggested, be sure to stick to the essential components you've used to develop your argument and prove your thesis statement. After a brief mention of your main points and development of argument, you should take the reader's interest in your topic even further by mentioning the implications of your stance or your thesis outside of the world of your essay. Consider the following questions to evaluate the implications of your stance. 1. What does my personal stance say about opinions that are different from my own? 2. Who or what is impacted by my stance? And 3. How does my stance contribute to making the world a better place or not so much? Again, these questions are broad for the purposes of allowing you to think about the value of your position in a more general manner. However, they should be answered very specifically in your conclusion paragraph to avoid clutter and unnecessary rambling. As a brief recap, the 3 components of an effective conclusion paragraph include a restatement of your thesis, a brief recap of the main points you use to support your argument, and some discussion about the implications of your personal stance on the topic of discussion. Now you will hear from Drisana, who will discuss the different types of conclusion paragraphs we see in writing. Thanks again for tuning in.
Hello everyone, my name is Drisana and I will be talking you through some conclusions in personal statements and in research and analytical papers. Leah did an amazing job of setting the stage with her explanation of introductions in these kinds of papers, and a lot of what she talked about you will hear referenced in this section. Thanks to Felicia, Arin, and Amaris, you should feel totally prepared to dive into some specific types of conclusions. Let's start with personal statements. Like Leah explained, personal statements are extremely flexible assignments that really depend on the requirements of the specific prompt. Generally speaking, your personal statement will likely include some sort of anecdote. This anecdote would not only act as an attention grabber, but it will also give the reader a closer look into who you are and how that relates to what you're applying for. In your conclusion, you could reference that anecdote once more. This would be a great way to come full circle in your personal statement and remind your reader why you included the anecdote in the first place, as well as reminding them why you were right for the scholarship, school, etc. Another way to conclude a personal statement is by addressing your future objectives in the context of the school or scholarship you are applying for. You might want to explain how this specific scholarship will help you achieve your goals, or how this specific school aligns with your future aspirations. By being explicit about why you are applying to this particular school or scholarship will show the reader that you are intentionally and thoughtfully applying to their program. Now that we have discussed 2 ways to conclude a personal statement, let's move on to discussing analytical and research papers. These 2 papers, though distinct in their content, have similar introductions and conclusions. As Leah explained, there are some important pieces of information that should be covered in your introduction. In the conclusion, however, you have a bit more flexibility. In both research and analytical papers, one thing to include in your conclusion is a summary of your paper's main ideas. In a research paper, this could look like restating your thesis and your research findings. In an analytical paper, this could look like wrapping up what you uncovered in your analysis. The second part of the conclusion is where these 2 papers differ. In a research paper, your conclusion should broaden and begin to look towards the future and address where your research leads, or make a call for further research to be conducted in the area that your paper does not cover. An analytical paper would conversely narrow down your findings and highlight and explain the more prominent aspects of your analysis. Each of these conclusions work best for this style of paper. Next in this workshop, you'll hear from Kaitlyn, who will guide you through a 2-slide review activity. Have fun!
Hi everyone, my name is Kaitlyn, and I want to thank you so much again for tuning into this workshop video in the first part of our Essential Elements for Writing workshop series. Now that we've talked through the functions, anatomy, and types of introductions and conclusions, let's do a little review to solidify these concepts. In just a moment, we will show you a list of elements typically found in introductions and conclusions. Take 20 seconds and sort the items into a Venn diagram or T-chart. based on whether the items would typically be found in the introduction, conclusion, or both. If you need more time, feel free to pause the video. Are you ready? Here we go. Well, let's see how you did. Earlier, Amaris chatted about the anatomy of both introductions and conclusions, so we'll use those key elements to sort this list. In your introduction, you want a good attention getter, which can come in the form of a funny anecdote. So, a funny anecdote and a hook to get your readers interested belong in the introduction circle. Any relevant background information and context should be given at the beginning of your essay, so it should go in your introduction as well. If you plan to implement any guiding principles, lenses, or theories, you want to introduce these to your readers early on. So let's put that there as well. In our conclusions, we want to provide a brief summary of our main points and discuss the implications of our argument. So we'll put a brief recap in the conclusion circle for sure. Two ways to think about implications are thinking about 1. How your argument impacts different perspectives, and 2. The value of your argument or position in the field. Those items will go in the conclusion circle as well. That leaves us with just 2 more. Your thesis statement should definitely go in your introduction, but remember, we want to restate it again in the conclusion to remind your reader what your argument is. Since we are writing for an argument, we always want to include the so what question whenever we talk about our thesis. Why should your audience care? Why is your argument important? Well, how did you do? After reviewing this video and doing our activity, I'm sure you'll craft effective introductions and conclusions in no time. Thanks for tuning in, everyone, to the first workshop in our 2020 Essential Elements for Writing series. For more information about the Center for Writing and Speaking at Agnes Scott College and our other programs, check out the rest of our YouTube channel and our official website at agnescott.edu/writing and speaking.